Hi guys, my name is Triya and I'm a junior doctor working in London. Last year I graduated from Oxford Medical School. Today I'm going to talk about everything I did to get into medical school at Oxford. So I'm going to be talking about how I went from this to this. So I thought I'd start by talking about why I wanted to study medicine and also why I wanted to study it at Oxford. So medicine is something that I had been considering since I was about 14 or 15. I always knew that I liked sciences, but I was more interested in the human aspect. When I was in school, I really liked all the sciences equally, so biology, chemistry and physics. And when I was considering my career options, I did think about being a science researcher specifically. And in school, we had these courses called Head Start courses, which essentially you get to experience what it's like to be a university student in a specific subject. And the one I signed up for was a physics-based course, which was actually in Oxford and it was for materials science. This was a one-week experience where we could live like a university student and experience the lectures and the experiments and things like that, just to get a feel for what that subject's really like. When I was studying material science there, I did find it interesting. However, I really thought that it lacked the human element. I didn't see any real connection and engagement with humans and relevance to human life, although I understand that bridges and things are really important. However, it just made it clear for me that I'm not engineering minded and that medicine would be better for me. So I chose to go to Oxford because I wanted to go to one of the best universities in the world. I also really liked the traditional academic nature of the course. When I went to the open day, I thought it was great as well. I think the journey for anyone when it comes to getting into Oxford or Cambridge starts at least with your GCSEs, because it should come as no surprise that Oxford and Cambridge really care a lot about your academics and your grades. So for me, for my GCSE subjects, I took compulsory subjects, which are maths, English language, English literature, biology, chemistry, physics, and then I also took German, Latin, history and geography, and further maths. I studied a lot for my GCSEs. I think I studied probably more than I needed to. And this was mainly driven by fear of failure and fear of the unknown, because I'd never sat these official board exams before. During study leave, I studied from anywhere between 6 to 10 hours a day. I'll talk more about my revision schedule in a different video. But in terms of grades, back when I did GCSEs, we had letter grades. So I think that an A star nowadays is equivalent to an 8 or a 9. For my grades, I got A stars in all of my subjects, which obviously I was really proud of, and I really think it was one of the things that made my application to Oxford a very strong one. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is work experience. So I think this was useful for Oxford, but it's also relevant to medical school applications in general. The first work experience I did was the summer after GCSEs, so between year 11 and year 12. I did a 1-week placement at a local hospital in the obstetrics and gynecology department. And the way I got this was one of the consultants there was a colleague of my parents. This raises an important point that I want to talk about with work experience. So getting work experience in a hospital is notoriously difficult, and medical school interviewers understand that. So my advice to people is to utilize their contacts in any way that they can in order to get work experience. So for example, if your parents know people, if you have neighbours, teachers, friends, that kind of thing who work in a hospital, then definitely reach out to them and see if you can do some work experience. People understand that especially post the pandemic, getting work experience in a hospital is hard. Another work experience that I did was at a local care home. So this was a 2-week program where I went and helped out with the classes. So there were art classes and exercise classes for the residents. I also helped doing things like serving lunch and tea and talking to people. This was an official program that you had to apply for, write a personal statement and do an interview for. And I heard about it because it was local to where I lived. So this was something that I had done on my own without sort of any connections. Sometimes medical schools will ask you, how did you get your work experience? And it's important to be truthful when you are asked this. But one thing that is really important for work experience is don't just do it to tick a box. One of the main reasons that you're doing the work experience, firstly, is for you to consider whether you actually like being in a hospital and whether you can actually see yourself there. For example, I remember spending one day in an ITU, so intensive care, and I remember thinking that the patients there, they're intubated, they are sedated, so they're asleep and they can't talk to you. And everyone was talking about them as if they were not there. And I just remember feeling that there was a certain lack of dignity around the patient. Now, this was just my experience as a teenager doing work experience then, but I remember thinking that I probably wouldn't enjoy an ICU job just because I didn't really like seeing the patients just as bodies with organs. I prefer to see them as people. But now that I've worked in an ICU, I think my opinions have changed. However, that's what I thought at the time. So when it comes to work experience, what's really important is firstly, it's for you to consider whether medicine is right for you. And secondly, it's more important what you got out of it rather than just saying I've done X number of days at this hospital. So it's much more valuable for you if you spend one day at a hospital, but you really gain an insight into, for example, patient experience or some kind of issue that happened in the hospital or something to do with the doctor, rather than just boasting about what placements you've had. So the reflections and the thoughts that you have from work experience are really important. And these are things that you will then talk about in your personal statement and at interview. So for example, I did my first work experience when I was in year 11, but that was almost a year and a half before my interview. So it's really important to take a journal or write notes so that you don't forget what you've seen and what you've reflected on when it comes to an interview, because you may have done the work experience when you were 16. So now I'm going to talk about my A-level subjects. So back when I did A-levels, we had AS level exams in year 12 and then A2 in year 13. I think now they've changed it so that all the final exams are in year 13, but A-levels are pretty similar regardless. So the subjects that I studied at A-level were biology, chemistry, physics and maths. Now traditionally what people used to do was take 4 subjects for year 12 in AS and then drop 1 and do 3 subjects at A2 to have 3 total A-levels. Now what I did was continue the 4 A-levels from year 12 into year 13 and have 4 A-levels in total. Now this was a big academic commitment because obviously 4 A-levels are hard work, but I had to think about my career choices. So for medicine, chemistry is compulsory and biology just made sense as a subject to do. I found maths to be a really important subject as well, so I didn't want to drop that, and that left physics, but I love physics so much that I didn't want to drop it either. So that's why I continued for A2 as well, and I actually think that studying for A-levels made my application to Oxford even more appealing, because it really demonstrates your academic rigour. And also I found that prospective medical students generally don't study physics. So when I went to my Oxford interviews, a lot of the interviewers saw that I studied physics and found that quite interesting, and therefore asked me questions about physics. But I do think this gave me an edge. On the downside, it meant that I had very little free time because all my free periods were taken up with physics. However, I don't regret it because I do think it helped me. On top of the A-levels, I also did something called an EPQ, or Extended Project Qualification. This is essentially a dissertation and you can do it in any research topic you like. I obviously made mine medicine related, and I talked about 3D printing and how it's going to revolutionize medicine and organ donation. Now, if you ask me if I regret doing an EPQ, I'd have to think quite carefully about that because it was a lot of hard work and I didn't really enjoy it at the time. I felt like I was already doing 4 A-levels and I had to do this whole other project on top of it. It definitely meant that I was stretched for time. However, it did teach me some basic principles when it comes to writing a dissertation. For example, the importance of referencing and the logistics of using a reference manager like Zotero or EndNote. And I could talk about it in my personal statement, and they did pick up on it at my interview as well. However, I didn't really enjoy the process, and I would think quite carefully if you are considering doing one on top of 4 A-levels. So now I'm going to talk about my university choices. So obviously I chose to apply to Oxford, but for medical school you can apply to 4 in total. So I applied to Oxford, Imperial College London, King's College London and Queen Mary's University of London as well. As you can see, aside from Oxford, they were all London universities, and this is because I really loved London as a city and knew I would want to end up working and living there eventually. For most courses, you can actually apply to 5 universities, but for medicine, it's 4. Prospective medical students have the option of applying for a 5th course that is not medicine. So traditionally, some people apply for biomedical science as their 5th insurance option, but I didn't really want to do this because I couldn't see myself actually studying biomedical science. So what I did for my 5th choice was I applied for natural sciences at UCL, and this may seem a bit rogue because obviously my personal statement was very geared towards medicine. However, I just thought I'd throw an application in there because I had nothing to lose really. UCL did end up getting back to me and they said that they liked my application, but they wanted me to write a specific personal statement just for natural sciences if I wanted to seriously automatically be considered as an applicant. However, by this point in time, I'd already got my offer from Oxford, so I said no. Another thing I want to talk about are the extracurricular and supracurricular activities that I took part in sixth form that helped me with my application to Oxford and to medicine in general. They traditionally say that Oxford and Cambridge don't really care about your extracurricular activities and they're more focused on academics. And yes, this is true. However, it's different for medicine because obviously to be a doctor, you have to show that you are suited personality-wise. Even Oxford do care to a certain extent about the other things that you do. Now, my advice for this is generally that anything you do in terms of hobbies and extracurricular activities, you can use those activities to demonstrate skills that would make you a good doctor without having to take up anything extra. So for example, if you do sports, you can use that to show your teamwork and leadership abilities. Generally, the key qualities that you want to demonstrate with your extracurriculars are things like leadership, teamwork, time management, organisation, integrity, that kind of thing. So for me personally, I did rowing, and because I liked writing, I also was the science editor of my school magazine. For leadership, I ran my school's medical and veterinary society, which was essentially organising weekly meetings where we discussed topics in medicine and how to boost our applications. So for example, just running a club or being a captain of a team, you can use to demonstrate leadership. So another thing that's really important for getting into Oxford and getting into medical school were the entrance exams. For Oxford Medical School, this is the BMAT, or the Biomedical Admissions Test, and for other medical schools, it's the UCAT, which back in my day was called the UK CAT. Out of the universities that I applied to, Oxford and Imperial took the BMAT, and Queen Mary's and King's accepted the UCAT. I think it works the same now, but when I was applying, you could take the UCAT at any point in time before your application, and you would have to take the BMAT at a specific date after you'd already submitted your application. So my advice would be to get the UCAT done as early as possible so that you free up some time. So I took the UCAT in the summer after year 12 and before year 13. I think I took it in late July or early August. And obviously that meant that my summer holiday was ruined because I had to revise for this test. But I was so happy that I got it out of the way, because when I got to year 13, the days flew by so quickly because you're submitting your UCAS application, you're studying for your A Levels, you're doing interview preparation. There's just so much going on that it's much better to have done it earlier. Obviously for the BMAT, it was a specific date, so there was nothing I could do, I just had to prepare. So as you can see from my university choices, I applied to 2 BMAT universities and 2 UCAT universities. I think this is a really good strategy just because you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket and only apply to UCAT universities or BMAT universities. People say that one of the advantages of UCAT is that you obviously have your score before you apply, whereas it's a bit of a gamble with the BMAT because you won't get your score until after you've already submitted your application. But to be honest, I recommend to everyone to do the BMAT as well, just because you may as well. So the BMAT is considered a more traditional exam with aspects of biology, chemistry, physics and maths in, as well as an essay writing component. Now this can sort of scare some people because it sounds quite intense, but I actually think that it's a lot easier because it's more similar to the exams you've already sat with the GCSE and A Levels, whereas the UCAT is more skills-based, assessing things like verbal reasoning, numerical reasoning, spatial reasoning, and these are quite unusual questions that you probably never experienced before. So my advice when it comes to the UCAT is just to do the question banks. So online, they have some free question banks and some paid ones that are official. I would say just do those. I don't think it's necessary to do a paid course because I think the most important thing is questions. Now for the BMAT, it's slightly different. So my advice would be to brush up on your GCSE level science knowledge. A lot of my friends who were applying to medical school and who hadn't studied physics for a long time had to brush up on their physics because they'd forgotten most of it. What they did was that they had special lessons from a physics teacher at school, so it's really good to utilize resources. When I was studying for this test, we got one of our religious studies / philosophy teachers to give us a couple of lessons on medical ethics just to help us with the essay writing component. To be honest, when it comes to Oxford, I didn't worry that much about the BMAT because of the way that Oxford would score the applicants. I don't think it's changed much. What they used to do was they would look at your GCSE grades and your BMAT score, and they would rank you based on these results, and then the people who were in the top, say, X number of students would then get invited to interview. So that meant that if you had really strong GCSEs, then you could get away with a slightly lower BMAT score, and vice versa. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is interviews. So for Oxford, you always have to do an interview, regardless of what subject you're applying for. But in general, for medical schools, you also have to do interviews for every single school. So I had interviews at Oxford, Imperial, King's College and Queen Mary's. My Oxford interview was first, it was in December, and then my Imperial interview was in January, my Queen Mary's interview was in February, and my King's interview was in March. I was kind of worried because obviously my first interview was in Oxford, and I'd ideally wanted to have some practice at other interviews before I got to Oxford, but actually it was quite nice to have it out of the way because it was the most important one to me. In terms of interview preparation, for Oxford in particular, it's quite difficult to prepare because you don't know what to expect. It's not really your traditional medical school interview. You could be asked anything from basic science to sociology or something completely different. The Oxford interviews aren't as crazy as they seem like in the media or in articles, but I definitely was asked some strange questions. In terms of Oxford, the way I prepared was by reading a lot of articles in the news and also in scientific journals, just to have an idea of the important innovations in science and healthcare at the time. So if you're preparing for a medical school interview now, I would suggest looking into things like artificial intelligence in healthcare and the effects of the pandemic, and maybe things like synthetic embryos or whatever really you find interesting. That's the key thing, to be honest. There's no point in reading lots of articles that you find quite boring. I would say just skim through the headlines and find ones that you actually find interesting. So in one of my Oxford interviews, someone did ask me what I was reading lately. So I think in my school report, my teacher had written that I like to read Nature, the scientific journal. Then the interviewer said, "Oh, I see you like to read Nature, tell me something you'd read." Another thing that I did for interview practice for medical school in general was I googled lists of common interview questions. So this will be things like, why do you want to study medicine, and some medical ethical questions. And now these are really good just to practice. Sometimes they'll ask you why medicine as a sort of intro or starter question. It's good to just have an idea of what you want to say. Because I'm quite a shy person by nature, I found that interview practice with other people was really daunting. So I started off by just answering questions by myself in my room. I would record them on my phone and then listen to my answers, which obviously was dreadfully embarrassing, but it was a good way of just getting used to hearing my own voice and articulating my thoughts. I then moved on to asking my sister to ask me questions or my friends, and then obviously getting interviewed by parents or teachers or colleagues would be the best in terms of mock interviews. I remember I had quite a brutal mock interview with one of my teachers just a few days before my actual Oxford interview, and I remember thinking that the actual Oxford interview itself was less stressful than the mock interview with this teacher, but it was quite good because it prepared me for a worst case scenario. So the way it works in Oxford Medical School is that you are interviewed at 2 different colleges. So I applied to St John's College, and at that college I had 2 interviews, but for fairness, you also get interviewed at another college. So for me, this was Queen's College. So my interviews were in person. So I went on Sunday night and I had 2 interviews on the Sunday at Queen's. I stayed over at Queen's College, and then on Monday I had 2 interviews at St John's. And the way it works is that although you apply to one college, you could be given a slot at either college depending on the numbers of applicants they have and that kind of thing. So in the end I was actually offered a position at Queen's rather than St John's, but I obviously took it because it didn't really matter that much to me what college I went to. It was just important to go to Oxford. Okay, so in terms of offers, I got an offer from Oxford, from Imperial and from Queen Mary's, and then I was put on the waiting list for King's. So my offer for Oxford was A star AAA. This was the same for Imperial, and then for Queen Mary's it was 3 A's. So I put Oxford as my first choice, and then I had to sadly reject Imperial because although I really liked it, the offer was the same as Oxford, so it didn't really work as a backup. So I then put Queen Mary's as my backup choice. So I'd gotten all my offers by about end of March, April time in year 13, and this meant that finally I could focus entirely on my A levels, which were coming up in June. Up until then, I had to sort of put my A levels on the back burner because I was focusing more on getting into medical school and particularly getting into Oxford. Oxford, so it was quite a relief to get to sort of Easter time and then only have A levels to revise for. Obviously, because I had been focusing so much on Oxford, I ended up letting my A level slip slightly. So for example, I found chemistry really difficult. I didn't give it enough time in the winter of year 13 because I was focusing on interviews and things. So when it came to my mock exam in January, I actually got a D in chemistry, but then I managed to thankfully get my grade up to an A by exam season because I focused a lot on it. But I don't regret doing this because I needed to focus all my time on getting into Oxford, and I knew that A levels could wait. So for my A level results, I got an A star in biology and A's in chemistry, physics and maths, and to be honest, I was really happy with this because it meant I got exactly what I needed to get into Oxford. So that's the story of how I got into Oxford Medical School. It was definitely one of the hardest things I had ever done in my life, but I remember it was worth it at the time because I wanted it so much. I think it's very difficult to put that much time and effort into something if you genuinely don't want it. I think when it comes to revising and academics, I do think that perhaps I revised too hard at the GCSE level. I don't think I actually had to study 10 hours a day, but I did it, and to be honest, I would rather regret studying too much than not studying enough and then not getting the grades. Definitely, as I have gotten older and gotten more used to studying for exams, I have prioritized work-life balance, so it's really important to make sure that you're eating healthily and that you're going out for exercise as well as studying, and not to put your entire life on hold. I think this is really important for medicine in particular because you'll obviously be doing exams all the way through medical school and even after you've graduated, because there's lots of postgraduate exams you need to take in order to become a specialist in your field. So developing healthy habits early on is really useful. So I also grew up with doctors in the family, so my parents are doctors and a lot of my close relatives are. I do understand the privilege this has given me, for example, when it comes to getting personal connections for work experience or having a sounding board when it comes to interview preparation. However, watching my parents grow up, I've seen how hard they work and how difficult their life is. So this has really made me consider whether I actually want to follow in their footsteps and be a doctor. So that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed the video and see you in the next one.